This is episode 329 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support our work and get special insider access to the making of our show. Learn more at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
So hi, I'm François Larocque, Emeritus Professor of English Literature and Early Modern Drama at Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3, Paris 3. And I'm the author of Shakespeare's Festive World. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this, That's Shakespeare Life, with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Muckhills were places where you could put commercial waste versus non-commercial waste, which is like human feces, right? Or certain kinds of, like, when you do composting yourself, you can't put like animal leavings, bone, things like that will actually destroy your sort of compost heap. So we think about them as large compost heaps and community heaps that are productively decaying in particular spaces. That ends up being far more productive.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Next time you're frustrated about household chores, you'll be comforted to know that even William Shakespeare had to take out the garbage. In his hometown of Stratford Upon Avon, public waste was managed through a system of piles known as Muckhills. In 1552, William Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, was charged a fine for one of these Muckhills that was kept across the street from his home on Henley Street. For a long time, scholars have thought this fine meant that John Shakespeare was keeping the dunghill illegally or perhaps was using it in a way that was against the law. But recent research into how Muckhills were operated and the history of public sanitation in Stratford Upon Avon have caused us to see this record of John Shakespeare in a new light. Here today to share with us how taking out the garbage worked for Shakespeare's lifetime is our guest, Elizabeth Tavares. Elizabeth Tavares is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama with the Hudson Strode Program in Renaissance Studies. Along with David Fallow, a former financier who has spent years studying the Shakespeare family's wealth, Elizabeth has published the book John Shakespeare's Muckhill, Ecologies, Economies, and Biographies of Communal Waste in Stratford Upon Avon from 1550 to 1600. In this publication and the research that went into it, they discovered that the history of public sanitation practices in Stratford Upon Avon changes the way we look at John Shakespeare's find. Elizabeth joins us today to share what they found, and you can learn more about Elizabeth and her work in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Elizabeth. So nice to have you here at That Shakespeare Life.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're kicking things off this week with my oldest son having asked this question. Elliot submitted this related to public sanitation. He was wondering about a particular person, or would it have been a business that was employed for the purpose of cleaning up cities like London? Specifically, he was curious about the Globe Theatre. I had told him about how they're very messy inside during a performance with food and beer and other things being down in the groundlings area, at least. And he was wondering whose job it would have been to clean up after the performances.
Oh, please pass my thanks on to Elliot. Such a good question. This article was looking at some regional community work, so I'm not 100% on what's happening in London, but we think we know a few things, and it's usually a combination of strategies that are working at the same time. So we have self-cleaning, that the building is doing things. There are building managers and then like municipal services that are helping keeping spaces clean. So the archaeology that we know about the Rose and the Globe, and the Rose was right across the street. Basically, they're right on the water, and their open air architecture helped facilitate the movement of water and waste. So England is going through a little ice age. There's lots of rain. They don't know what to do with all this extra wet. And you can see sort of the outdoor playhouses, even as they get renovated, they're really working towards managing their water and waste. So that those things are open air. There are drains that are built at the foot of the stage that help all of the water and waste drain out into the Thames. Those playhouses are literally right on the river. So that's helping doing that. And then the roof over the stage that gets added also helps manage water and waste flow out. And then the flooring also helps. It has gravel and probably nutshells from the soapworks down the road. And that's also helping facilitate the movement of waste, water, oyster shells, snacks, sort of move through those buildings rather than having sort of constant cleaning. There are building managers as well. Henslow is the landlord for the Rhodes Playhouse, and he's fined to cleanse and scour and lop the willows that hang over the common sewer next to the building. But that's not necessarily about like dung or muck. That's just like trees falling and keeping those clear. And he's sort of in charge of doing that. And then we know of a couple other people who are like in charge of the building in different ways. There's this guy named Coachman Symes, a person called Stephen the Tireman, and there's a couple of prop men, people who build props. So they seem to be like managing the tiring house, short for a tire, the place you got like a green room. But they're also like managing all the props and materials and things, and they might have also been responsible for caring for the place. There's this really great play called Playhouse to Let. It's by Davenant. And it's a mid-17th century play, but it's making fun of these old playhouses from the sort of previous generation. And they have characters named the housekeeper, the tire woman, and the chairwoman. And she's like shelling beans at the very start of this play, like in the middle of a playhouse, making a mess, basically. But no one wants to come. So they, under the nose of the landlord, they rent it out to all these really poor actors and performers who come by and want to rent it out because no one wants to come. So we kind of see, even in plays of a later period, people sort of caring for the space. But I'm always curious about how much like care happens in these places. There's certainly services you could hire. There were carting services and regular street cleaners that you could hire in London, certainly, if you needed a sort of big job done. But certainly based on like the archaeology, we have like evidence in the flooring of the Rose and Globe of like children's toys, beads from the bottoms of women's dresses, and cutlery, like drop spoons and forks, because you carried your own in your pocket. You didn't borrow others. Right. Those things are all sort of dropped. And not picked up. So I wonder how much like cleaning is actually happening in the space versus like their sort of natural processes for moving decayable waste out and through those buildings. So for like the playhouses in London, those are some of the things I think you kind of have a couple different factors contributing to managing the mess that your groundlings make, as it were.
But yeah, those pieces of archaeological artifacts being found there, you'd think if they had swept the space, you'd have found them in a pile somewhere instead of still on the floor of the theater. That makes sense. For those that are not deep into the archaeological research here for these things, can you tell us just briefly, when you found records of people like Coachman Symes or Stephen the Tireman, where were you finding records to these individuals?
I know other guests you've had have talked about this really amazing set of materials that survive. We refer to it as Henslow's diary, but it's a whole bunch of papers that were kept by Philip Henslow and his wife and his daughter and a couple of other people, with many hands in those documents, sort of recording what's happening in those playhouses. It's a lot of money. You don't get a literature degree to do a bunch of math necessarily.
You don't expect to anyway.
No. But there's a lot of really cool financial data, certainly like how they are sourcing costumes. It's a lot of like older women donating clothes, right? There's this whole sort of pawning trade and things like that. But you get lots of really interesting details about the space and renovation. So when the playhouses closed in 1591-92 due to plague outbreak, something we're all very familiar with, one of the things Henslow does to the Rose is renovate it. He adds a roof over the stage and sort of restructures the stage face. And so in doing that, you also get leavings behind. But in the sort of archaeological digs, you find lots of like materials from those spaces. But Henslow's diaries list like every day who he paid for how many nails. And he like buys them lunch on most days too. And it's all in like
what a nice
same
manager. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so there's all this like there are payments for work and food kind of always sort of combined. I have some work on like meeting and eating, and you can see him paying for lots of beer and wine and drinks when they're testing, some actors from the Admiral's Men are together at this tavern across the river and they're thinking about buying a new play, and he pays for a whole bunch of wine, and it's like an absurd amount of alcohol that they drink while they're figuring out whether they want to do this play or not. So there's lots of like food as productive for
sounds like a theater
exchange,
to me.
Right?
Well, now obviously London is a big place and it operated differently than smaller towns like Stratford upon Avon. But I wonder, since your work looked at more regional goings on. Tell us about, in somewhere like Shakespeare's hometown, would there have been these similar systems? Like you're mentioning, Henslow's has access to a lot of different services and contractors that could be brought in for doing this. But in a smaller town, were there things like street cleaning or waste management that operated in a village, for example?
Yeah, I like the term contractor. That's really, I think, really useful sort of framework. So these sort of late medieval towns were developed in the 12th century, and they seem to be, there's some level of urban design going on where they have this holistic environmental system that thinks about design, reuse of materials within the town, and then other kinds of municipal services for sort of managing public sanitation. And so one of the things we talk about, and I have a co-author on the piece as well, who's interested in the Shakespeare family finances, and that's kind of how he came to the project. There's this, Stratford is this gridded town plan, which many sort of 12th century sort of communities end up using. It's really common, and they're oriented towards a major waterway. So that the Avon matters a very great deal. And so it's oriented towards the Avon. You kind of have this gridded town plan on a slope. So we always have everything running down the slope into the water.
And if you're not familiar with Stratford upon Avon, the Avon is a big river that runs right through the center of town.
Yep. And there's a really lovely old Roman bridge that we still use. And it was the only pass through. And it was a major bridge on the Saltway, which connected the two major Roman salt works in England at the time. So it's a very old road, and it's called a street. And the street is a Roman word for a road that was paved. So you can sort of have a sense that there's this priority road that Stratford then builds it sort of self around on this sort of Roman area. And on the north side of town, you have gravel pits as well as on the south side. So you have all of this sort of naturally forming gravel, what was a gravel quarry, and then water. So it's actually a town sort of ideally designed to manage water and lots of foot traffic in interesting ways. So you have this gridded town plan along that sort of Roman Saltway. And then you have sort of like three forking roads once you get across that choke point of the Roman bridge. And one of those was Henley Street, which we know sort of famously is where Shakespeare's birthplace was. And on the very top of that road was the tenement that was rented. And across the street would have been the Muckhill that is the sort of subject of this piece. So it is one of six. There are six Muckhills actually instead of just one. And they are one of the systems in place that the city is using to manage its refuse and waste in the town as a dumping site.
Now, you mentioned the Muckhill here, and I did want to kind of address that specifically because there's some primary documents about John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, that reference a Muckhill. And now, Elizabeth, this is not something that we're familiar with today. So was this a community dung heap or muck heap? And was it for only throwing out collected human feces, or was there, was it an alternative to a toilet, for example, or was this all forms of garbage, something more similar to maybe a community compost bin, for example?
Yeah, so the Muckhill has some funny status in Shakespeare biography because it's the first sort of record of the Shakespeares in Stratford. John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's dad, is an immigrant. We don't really know where he's coming from. He's settling in the city, and it's sort of the first financial record of him being there. And he's fined along with two other artisans for this space, and we'll talk more about what that fine means. But what is a Muckhill? So it's a place where you could productively decay things in a composting process. So Muckhills were places where you could put commercial waste versus non-commercial waste, which is like human feces, right? Or certain kinds of, like, when you do composting yourself, you can't put like animal leavings, bone, things like that will actually destroy your sort of compost heap. So we think about them as large compost heaps and community heaps that are productively decaying in particular spaces. That ends up being far more productive. And the legal records in Stratford are really specific about this. They call the Muckhills as separate from garbage. So everyone is a leather worker in some stripe in Stratford. It's a town of artisans, not farmers. We've thought about Stratford as a very bucolic place, but based on the city plan, no one's like attached to a farm plot. This is really a place where your working space of your home was on the first floor, you lived on the top floor, and you might have a compost heap up front that you are selling decaying refuse, soil, urine that you might have collected, which is crucial to almost every part of the leatherworking process. You might sell that or collect a fee for people to dump it in front of your home. So it's almost like having extra stuff for sale at your point of sale when you're checking someone out. from buying some goods, you're going to have that sort of right next to the front of your home.
Your impulse buys at the checkout counter.
Your impulse buys is like, I actually need a little bit of extra fertilizer for my garden at home. So everyone had a garden in the back of their homes, and below they would have had a cesspool. So that's where you would have had your home sort of space, right? Where you would put any sort of feces or things like that. You would have a necessary, which is your sort of outhouse. And then you'd have chamber pots and things for relieving yourself during the day. But no one's like putting their poop, right? In a muckhill, garbage is for things that couldn't decay in any way. Certainly, like, they're really worried about the heads and bellies of animals that are being slaughtered, and they have to be taken outside the town before 9 o'clock at night. And it's deeply policed, and they continue to have lots of issues around that kind of dumping.
Very much concerned with things like smell and vermin and not wanting that to collect right there on the street.
And I don't even know if smell, I think it's really about vermin and stuff that couldn't be resold. And because Stratford is a major market town, they have 4 different market spots, and they have every Thursday major markets. And then they also had a really big summer market fair. People are moving through the city a lot. And so I think it's more about preserving the paved roads and also not having stuff impeding traffic more than anything else.
In her article on John Shakespeare and this dung heap he paid for, Elizabeth writes that, quote, Muckhills like that on Henley Street were a source of borough rent and revenue, end quote. Now, Elizabeth, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but tell us about how Muckhills were a source of revenue. Who was doing the buying and the selling of these compost piles?
So, like, this early find really gives us this handy snapshot of a town evolving. So 5052 is an interesting year when this first sort of record occurs. It's the year that, again, we first sort of have the Shakespeares in this town, but it's also the last year of this leet or manorial court. It's the court that's sort of run by the local lord, and they made income from fines and fees and taxes. And every time you broke a law, it was the person who reported on you, as well as the sort of like manorial lord, that got to keep that income. Stratford is not yet incorporated as a borough. It's not recognized basically as its own town until the next year in 1553. So they no longer have to use the leet court or the manorial court, and they start their own court, which is called the Frank Pledge, and their 12 justices are all members of the community. And then any fines, fees that they collect, right, goes back into the community for waste management, approving of roads, all those kinds of things. So when the town gets incorporated, they get to have much more control over any of those fines, fees. And it's also in that year that they start the rent rolls. So this is basically the annual property tax collection that happens as well. And common muckhills, there are 6 major ones. The people who are managing them pay property taxes every year on them as if they're a building. So these have been clearly long established in the area, and the 6 are sort of, it's called the circuit of the town is how it's described, and they ring the city of Stratford, so they're clearly on the periphery. And the people who are in charge of managing them, they pay an annual tax, sort of like a privilege, so that then they get to manage that particular resource, dump things, take stuff out of it that they can use for their own leatherworking processes, or charge people a really small fee to like deposit. If you have like a privatized dump in your town where you have to pay a couple bucks to dump a large amount of trash or something like that, it's a sort of similar process. So you sort of see the fine that we get for John Shakespeare and his colleagues is really sort of a one-time ad hoc process of managing these spaces as this community is shifting and changing, where they get to have control over the revenue that they're collecting, both for fines, but also these spaces that are sort of community owned, but individuals sort of pay an annual tax to have the privilege of being in charge of. And we know that partly because John Shakespeare and Quiney are not the last ones who manage that muckhill. William Chambers and Roger Sadler inherit the Henley muckhill and get to be in charge of it over time. So we kind of have a lineage of who's in charge of that space, earning revenue, paying the city for that privilege over time. So it's sort of like a proto-property tax before the city has a system of managing it themselves.
So this evidence suggests that John Shakespeare might not have been in trouble for having a dung heap, but instead was just paying his rent when the document lists him as paying a fine for the dung heap. How should we interpret this record about John Shakespeare?
Yeah, it's really unclear. The word fine isn't exclusively punitive as it is today, it's got like this real punitive resonance. And medieval scholars I've talked to who work in a wide variety of fields are like, yeah, it's more of a fee, but we don't have a good translation. I think we just don't have a really good equivalency for what that is doing. It's really a tool to financially manage who has the right to sell from a muckhill. It gives them a structure sort of before the borough gets incorporated. That's not to say that John Shakespeare isn't doing other salacious things in the financial record. But this one thing, again, it's also a collective fine. He's fined with 2 other leather workers. And this is a town of haberdashers and milliners and drapers and dyers. It's all these people who really work with leather goods and fabrics, right? So it makes sense that they would really care about this resource and need it for the sort of artisanal trade of the town. But yeah, it's probably more likely based on like the next several decades of rent rolls, the system they kind of had in place before you could really sort of have that privilege. And eventually the city just takes it over entirely. And instead of paying someone else, they just collect all the revenue because that ends up being better.
So how much did it cost to pay for a dung heap? And why was it actually piled on the street in somewhere instead of somewhere, more out of the way, I would think? Like you're mentioning, it's right across the street from where they were living, which I want to think made John Shakespeare pretty motivated to pay to keep it there since that was convenient. He didn't have to go further to deposit his things. But tell us about this process, okay? How much did it cost to manage it? And then what were the tasks involved in managing a muckhill? Like, did it ever get hauled away or emptied out, or did it just sit there indefinitely?
Yeah, I mean, these seem to be multi-generational Muckhills. Like there are multiple family members who like pass on some of these. So these seem to be long-standing, sort of impermanent but locatable things that, again, you could charge a rent for, like a property tax for, because they're there. So cost, it really depended on what was being dumped versus what was being taken away, because of course you're kind of doing both. And so the muckhill sort of is ever taken away. It's always sort of changing and evolving. By 1560, it's like a privatized utility. So it's sort of like paying a private company to be in charge of all the parking meters in a city. So it's sort of like a privatized utility. And there's an annual property tax for the privilege of like 1.5 shillings, which is not a tiny amount, but not like a huge amount. By 1563, the city is just in charge of it. And they set up a whole bunch of structures and fines. So if you're found with an illegal heap, it's 3 shillings. As a fine. And that's like 3 times the original fine that John Shakespeare is given like a decade earlier. So again, we kind of see that those are just not being seen as equal.
How much was John Shakespeare charged?
He was charged like about 1 shilling. Yeah.
Okay.
The equivalency of about 1 shilling. It's in the detail in the record. So he's given, right? So it's about 3 times the fine that John Shakespeare has about a decade earlier. And then it's about 10 shillings if you're caught illegally dumping in one that shouldn't be there. I mentioned earlier there are 2 gravel pits, and they are also distinguished as really different. The northern one is one that you were allowed to go to take gravel out to do paving, filtration, fix your cesspool, right, your septic tank. The southern one was for dumping specifically. It's closer to the water. So that was sort of, but if you were caught dumping in the wrong gravel sort of pit, you were also fined. So you kind of have a number of places you're not supposed to be dumping because they are sources of materials that you need for your businesses. So if you're caught throwing garbage in there. So this seems to be about the management of those things. So it's more about the fines. But like anything else, it doesn't seem like there was sprawl happening when you're talking about the locations of a muckhill, but they're kind of being like managed like a compost heap. Like today you might have like a wooden crate or some sort of like very loose sort of materials containing that site, because for composting, you need air to be passing through in order for it to actually decay. So you can't close off, right, a compost heap. So it's also like an inside outside. You can't really contain it. So I think that also gives a kind of challenge to how you describe these things. There's lots of rules about managing them so that they don't spread into the street, but it's more about making sure it's not impeding traffic, but in front of homes. So it's still a sort of point of sale.
Elizabeth writes that this dung heap situation with John Shakespeare marks a turning point for Stratford Upon Avon that instigated a period of evolution of waste management practices in Stratford. Elizabeth, tell us about this process. What other kinds of waste management were ushered in after the infrastructure of a community dung heap was established?
Yeah, so there's lots of extended sort of practices. Again, managing these muckhills are really important, especially as Stratford continues to grow as a town of refined goods rather than export goods. And that's just a general shift that England is experiencing. Instead of like exporting huge amounts of wool or sheep, they're actually refining those things back at home. but also like managing the two waterways. They slowly disappear in the maps. They get covered over, I think initially to be protected, and then they disappear as the different needs of the city change in Stratford. And obviously Stratford as a tourist destination has really changed how that town gets used, which I think is really interesting. There's a lot of sort of firsthand accounts of Bridge and Henley Street being really desirable places like in the 1980s, because really big delivery trucks, big lorries could pull up on Henley Street and drop off large amounts of goods as a sort of like back alley for delivery. And again, that would make sense why you would want Muckhills there in your gravel pits there, and you want businesses along that street if you're going to be having lots of animals on the hoof moving through that area, dropping them off for butchers or leatherworking and things like that. So you can see the city still really using that choke point of the bridge coming all the way up Henley Street as a delivery site for big chain stores. And now that the Royal Shakespeare Company is there, right, was built in 1961, it's in the southernmost part, literally on top of the gravel pit that was used as sort of the garbage dump. They filled it in, and the city has thus reoriented where everyone wants to be in that really southern part of Stratford, which is where none of the sort of like business would have happened. And so how people are trying to move through Stratford is often really frustrating because all the businesses are all sort of in one area that has walkable streets. And then as you move sort of like south through the city, you would have gotten to like where all the animal pens were, where all the butchers were, where they were keeping sheep and livestock, right? Which is not sort of a place that was for foot traffic. And then the RSC is like literally sitting south of it, the Royal Shakespeare Company. So it's sort of reoriented where people want to be in the town. And I think it kind of like makes it really frustrating for some tourists to move through it. All the restaurants and good stuff are on one part and everything else on the other end. So you can kind of see how it's used today, working against the sort of natural ecology as it was developed.
Elizabeth, as someone who's done tremendous research in this area, we're excited to ask you to provide some reliable starting points for us when we want to learn more about public works and sanitation in Stratford upon Avon for Shakespeare's lifetime. What are some of your favorite resources you can recommend we use as good places to learn more?
Yeah, so this project really came out of an interest in like ecohistory and climate science. And one of my favorite sort of like starter books for this is Brian Fagan's The Little Ice Age, How Climate Made History. It's a really good primer to just start learning about the European experience of climate change right before what we call the Industrial Revolution. You know, that parts of the world we never thought would make wine were making wine, among other things, like how climate change really, he's got really great anecdotes and story that bring that home. I just can't sing the praises of Dolly Jorgensen's work enough. She's just got a brand new book out called The Medieval Pig, and pigs are the other sort of major Muckhill tool. They are the things that are eating pigs are very urban in this period. They're not farming animals. They're really great at being just moving composters themselves and eating up everything that's undesirable. So she's got a great new book on this, but she's got this article called Modernity and Medieval Muck in Nature and Culture. And it's got this really good argument about what's at stake when we reconstruct waste practices of the historical past in TV shows. Probably part of what Eliot was thinking is like everything is dirty and stinky and in the past world. And it's absolutely not. If you do walking tours of London, there's lots of great corners of really wonderful medieval buildings that have like spray guards, stone spray guards. So if you were going to urinate in public, you would spray that urine back on yourself. So there's stuff like built into the architecture of cities about managing waste in different ways. But we sort of think of it as this dirty past. And she has this really great argument about how sort of like colonial European practices and literature were brought across the world. And those are all water-based waste management practices. And so we brought water-based waste management practices to places that don't have a lot of water. That's not a good resource for managing waste, and how that sort of like changed how we're dealing with climate change broadly. So she has this really great argument about medieval sort of waste practices that gets at larger stakes of climate change. And then Timothy Morton's book, Ecology Without Nature, really thinks about nature as this umbrella term for the words we use to try to describe environmental phenomenon. And if we can get out from under that word nature and really realize everything is a sort of natural ecological project, we can kind of get a better climate change policy. So he's really thinking about the rhetoric of what counts as natural or not as well. And I find those as like useful frameworks to start thinking about climate and ecohistory.
I would agree about Eliot's perspective. It does sound like the whole place was dirty. When you read about it, there, from the chamber pots to the cesspools, you think, how was this functioning? That makes it really exciting to explore some of these resources that you've mentioned for us, that we can challenge some of our preconceptions or assumptions that we make about the past. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Elliot, for suggesting this question and helping us go down this path of fun investigation into public sanitation for Shakespeare's lifetime. We will place a list of these links in the show notes for today's episode, so you can go directly to these books that Elizabeth has recommended. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Elizabeth, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, if I can have Shakespeare, then I probably take along my other literary love, which is my husband. He is a poet, Matthew Menacucci. So I'd probably take one of his books along with me if I couldn't take him.
Oh, well, see, that's perfect. You can't get a better resource than that, I guess. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
My research interest is on collaboration and artist collectives, which is sort of how this project came about. But I'm finishing a book on playing companies and the repertory system in early modern England. So thinking about how different artists collaborated and what was sort of normal for Shakespeare's theater when he was coming to train. So thinking about people being lit on fire and pyrotechnicists and tumblers being incorporated into early history plays and things like that.
Oh, we will definitely look forward to seeing that publication come to life. We always like hearing about pyrotechnics and tumblers around here. So we'll look forward to seeing you put that together. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Tavares, for being here with us to share with us the history of public sanitation and understanding John Shakespeare and that fine he got for the Muckhills on Henley Street. I think we have all had this piece of history illuminated better for us for you being here. Thank you so much for being here to take us through it. As promised, all the links Elizabeth suggests for you today, if you would like to learn more about the history of taking out the garbage in Shakespeare's hometown, are available right now in the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 329. While you're on our show notes page, if you would like a more in-depth visual look at the history of sanitation and public works during Shakespeare's lifetime, including a copy of the paper where John Shakespeare was found, a map of where all the dung heaps were located in the town, and more extras like these, then use the Become a Patron button on the show notes page to either join us as a patron or log in using your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of our show. And all of these extras will expand right there on the show notes page. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 329. That's CassidyCash.com/EP329. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Patrons of our show get bonus history content with every episode, along with the opportunity to participate in the making of our show with the chance to submit questions that get asked in an upcoming interview. Along with these special extras, we also offer educator resources on our Patreon page, including activity kits, lesson plans, and an entire printable resource library that coordinates with our show and with Shakespeare's plays, all put together for you into a 35-week syllabus that maps out how to use these resources for a full dual credit course in literature and history. You can find out more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.